Forgot about Turning Point. Yeah, that's a whole nother thing.
Yep.
All right.
And
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club Scuttlebutt for Monday, July 29th. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. It's great to see you all here this evening for, I think, what we're going to have is a wonderful program, talking with a returning guest, Brian Morra, the author of The Righteous Arrows. Brian has been on with us before to talk about his first book in this series, The Able Archers. Brian, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing very well. Very well. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to see everybody.
Excellent. We'll be with you in just a sec. And joining me from, where are you coming in from, Todd?
Ypsilanti, Michigan, at a Hampton Inn in Ypsilanti, Michigan. I'm on the road. Behind me is a Little League baseball team that just won the state title, and they are celebrating with their families big time. So I'm down here in the little business office. So if you see kids running around, that's what it is.
Are you going to go out and celebrate with them afterwards?
I might, depending on how exciting Brian is, I might go out there and join them. And I just do want to say, and I know Henry Shepke is with us, so I'm saying this for his benefit. This Hampton Inn that I'm staying in is right next to Willow Run, which was Henry Ford's gigantic factory that produced B-24s during World War II. I think about 3/4 of all B-24s were built just right over that way. And there's a little museum there for it that I might check out tomorrow morning.
That sounds excellent. Looking around the room, I see a lot of returning faces and some faces I haven't seen in quite a little while. Bob Mizwa, it's great to see you again. Scott Masters, a pleasure as always. Mark Spiritigliosi, always a pleasure. John Kramer, feel like I haven't seen you in quite a while. It's great to see you. And Julia Parsons, I see you. I asked you to unmute, but I just wanted to get an update on hopefully that you're feeling better. We know that you had a little accident, so if you can unmute, oh, you are. Can we hear you?
Can they hear you?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah. Speak to them. Hi, Sean.
Julia, how are you feeling? Hi, Sue.
Sean asked how you're feeling. Everybody wants to know.
Oh, I'm feeling quite good.
Excellent.
But I need a lot of therapy.
I'm sure, Julia, but we're all pulling for you. Hopefully you received the letters, but we've all been thinking about you and hoping and wishing you well.
Oh, thank you. Thank them. I've gotten a lot of cards, which is great.
Well,
decorated my whole room.
That's fantastic. I'll tell you, when I was 6, I broke my left femur and I was in traction for like 6 weeks. Long time that I was in there. And then and I had my whole kindergarten class send me like a ton of cards. So I know what you're going through. It's nice to just hear from people from the outside world because you're just sort of in there and taking care of yourself. But we're all thinking about you. We're all pulling for you. And please continue to do your therapy and heal up because we'll have you back soon enough.
He's just saying that everybody's pulling for you and wishing you well.
Oh, that's nice. I'm sure it helps. Certainly helps my morale anyway.
Well, anything you need, you reach out to us. We're happy to help. Rick, you had your hand up. Did you want to add something for Julia?
Yeah, I wanted Julia to know that I visited the National Cryptologic Museum at NSA, and I stood next to the bomb, and I saw all your Enigma machines.
He saw all the Enigma machines.
Oh, did you? Oh,
And
More Enigma machines.
That bomb was huge.
oh, good. I'm glad, Rick. That's good.
And the bomb was the gigantic computer, the first computer device that was created to decode Enigma. So you actually saw the National Cryptologic Museum, the actual computer, one of the bombs, Rick.
Yes, and I got a lot of information for you if you haven't been there.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I'm done.
She would probably love that. Would you love to see his pictures?
Yes, indeed.
Rick, it's a date. You have to show up and show Julia some of your pictures.
I got
We'll get
you.
them here for you online. Brian, Brian, Morra, have you been to that Cryptologic Museum?
I have. It's been years since I've been there, but yeah, in fact, I was making a mental note during that discussion that I should, while I'm in the DC area, I should get up there this summer and take another look at it.
As an intelligence guy yourself, was it something that sort of like spoke to you? Was it like these are the beginnings of like intelligence in the military? And did it kind of like, did you nerd out a bit is what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Of course. And yeah, it's a fine museum. And I think they've done, as I understand it, I think they've done some revitalization work there in the last year or two. So it's probably even a better place to visit now. The CIA Museum is also an excellent place to go. Unfortunately, that's not open to the public, but yeah, they're both very good museums.
Excellent. We're going to dive right in, Brian, just a second. But for all of you joining us, thank you all again. Again, we are the Veterans Breakfast Club, and our mission is creating communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. All of the programs that we produce Mondays and Thursday nights, our in-person breakfasts, they're all made possible by your generous support, and we invite you to donate to the VBC by visiting www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. On there, you can check out all of our past programs, check out our blog, sign up to be a member, send us your address to get one of our free quarterly magazines. We'll get into all that later in the program, but we're going to dive right in with Brian now. Brian, you were on with us back when you released the first book in your series, The Able Archers. Can you give us sort of like an overview of your service, just to kind of refresh us on your time in the military?
Sure, be happy to. I was commissioned in early 1979 and went in the Air Force and went through Air Force officers training school to get commissioned, and went through the Air Force's Air Intelligence School, which in those days was in Denver, Colorado, which was a very good school. And then I went from there to a couple of three-letter schools, two agencies that we've already discussed this evening briefly. I can talk about one openly. I did go through the Cryptologic School at NSA. And then I was assigned for nearly 4 years in Japan, outside of Tokyo, at Yokota Air Base, which some of you may be familiar with, which is where the headquarters of U.S. Forces Japan is located. Some of the highlights of that service are covered in my first book, The Able Archers. And from there, I was assigned to a special intelligence unit in Washington, D.C. that was based at Bolling Air Force Base. And it went by the name of the Soviet Affairs Directorate. And everybody who was assigned there was a Soviet expert. Most people were Russian linguists. And we did all sorts of different things. One of the things we did was we supported the military liaison mission in Berlin, which many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with, which is also the subject of some of the stories in both The Able Archers and The Righteous Arrows, the military liaison mission, that is. And then from that assignment, I went to the Air Staff, and I was the morning intelligence briefer for the Chief of Staff and the Secretary of the Air Force for about 2 years, and then went into a staff assignment, which was very interesting because I was involved in the establishment of the first Space Command back in the mid 1980s. And then I also was involved later in some of our support to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which is partly what I tapped into for the Righteous Arrows. I left active duty when I was 30, and I stayed in the reserve for about 6 years. I served during the Persian Gulf War in an office called Checkmate, which some Air Force people might know if on the call tonight. Checkmate is the campaign planning cell in the Pentagon. So we were the guys that put together the initial air campaign for Desert Storm. And I was initially the only intelligence officer assigned to that unit. I was recalled to active duty. And that was a fascinating thing to go through. And we briefed General Schwarzkopf a lot. We briefed Secretary Cheney and Chairman Powell fairly frequently during the Desert Shield period. And then once the war started, also updated them quite often. And we had quite a few briefings with General Schwarzkopf, both at MacDill Air Force Base and also over in Riyadh. And I stayed in the reserve for a couple more years after that, but then my career overcame my ability to do much reserve service any longer. So I unfortunately left the reserves early. The main reason I did was because I had a few specific skills that were in high demand, and the Air Force wanted to activate me all the time. And I had another career going on, and I really couldn't afford to do that. So unfortunately resigned my commission and left the reserves as well. But I think altogether I had about 14, 15 years of combined active and reserve service.
Are you allowed to talk about what those skills were?
Well, one was being a Russian linguist. And I also had some other specialized intelligence skills that in HUMINT and SIGINT that were in high demand. I was a Soviet area specialist. So anytime there was anything heating up with the Soviets or the former Soviet Union, I was in high demand. In fact, just a quick anecdote, and after 9/11, and I'd been out of the reserves for quite a few years, but just a couple of weeks after 9/11, I got a call in my office from a guy who turned out to be the vice commander of Air Force Special Operations Command. And he was calling me because he wanted to activate me and bring me over to Pakistan and insert me into Afghanistan. And I had to tell him that I wasn't in the reserve in any capacity anymore. And he tried to finagle a way to bring me on active duty, and that didn't work. And I told him I really can't do it for personal reasons at the moment. But it was kind of a funny thing because he then contacted CIA and asked if CIA would bring me on. And they were like, sure, we know it, Brian, we'll bring him on. But it never happened. And I was mainly, it was because of me. It didn't happen because I had personal reasons not to be able to do it at the time. And I wasn't in the reserve anymore. It hadn't been, as I said, for a few years. But that I just bring that up because it's an indication that the kind of skill sets I had were still in high demand, even in the post 9/11 world.
I see a lot of thumbs up for Brad's question in the chat here. That you hear your thoughts, and I would as well, about views on Putin and Ukraine. I feel like we'd be getting ahead of ourselves in the story at this point if we dive into that. So we'll save that a little later. So everybody, that's a teaser. Come back later for the answer here. But what I'd like to start with, really, after hearing more about your service, is you did do a recent documentary, and I've talked about it over the last probably month. I keep telling people to watch Turning Point, from the bomb to the Cold War on Netflix. It's a 6-part series, incredible. And I learned so much about Russia and how the relationship, how we've gotten to where we are today with Russia and Ukraine, and different things. And I was so amazed by how this started. I didn't know that Stalin was as bad as he was. And I just want you to kind of give us an overview of what that series is. Maybe like, our why should we be interested in it? Why does it, what do we need to learn from that series?
Yeah, I got involved in that series very early as they were putting it together. It's called Turning Point, the Bomb in the Cold War, and I do highly recommend it. I believe it's an 8-part series, and it traces it uses atomic weaponry as kind of the unifying theme, but it does discuss the Cold War from its inception through the end of the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet era in Russia. And they do a good job, I think, with everything. And they filmed me for the episode, and it's episode number 5 that they did on the Able Archer crisis, on the Soviet nuclear war scare of 1983. So I'm on camera for that a lot. They also did interview me a lot for the Soviet war in Afghanistan, but they ended up not using any of that footage. And one thing that I think is a slight shortcoming in the series is they did give kind of short shrift to the Soviet war in Afghanistan and its reverberations through history, which I think are many. But overall, the series begins actually in the late 1930s with German scientists splitting the atom and Adolf Hitler ordering a nuclear weapons program in Nazi Germany. And the race that then ensued between the United States and Germany to build the bomb first. So it gives you some of that background. As Sean mentioned, it also gives background on Stalin and his brutalization of Ukraine in the 1930s. And it extends then through World War II. And of course, the Cold War really begins in the late 1940s. So the series, each of the installments in the series is about an hour and 15 minutes in length. And they take a chunk of time. They walk through the Cold War chronologically in the 8 episodes. And as I said, episode number 5 is, if I have that right, I think I do, is the one that's on the 1983 nuclear war crisis. But yeah, overall, it's done very, very well. I do recommend it. And the archival footage that they found, the film footage, is just astonishing. Some of it just astonishing. So they really did a great job with it.
Where would you say the tensions between the US and Russia really began?
Well, I probably in 1919. I think that the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, and some Americans remember, but I imagine quite a few don't, that the United States got involved in the Russian Civil War in 1919, 1920. And there were U.S. troops actually were landed in what became the Soviet Far East. And we were supporting the whites, who were the anti-communist forces. So, and the Russians remember that. The communists remember that the United States fought against them, or at least supported the whites in the Civil War. And there was tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, I think, all through the 20s and 30s. Of course, we became allies of convenience during World War II, since we had a common enemy in Nazi Germany. But and then, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, it was clear that the Soviets felt they deserved to run most of Europe, if not all of it. And that's really where the clash between not just the United States, but the other powers, principally Great Britain and France and the United States, really began. And then you all probably know the history beyond that pretty well. But yeah, the late 1940s is when the Cold War really kicked in.
Stepping into your service for a second, you became a linguist in Russian during your time in service?
I studied Russian in college, so I actually never received any Russian language training when I was in the Air Force. I received a little bit of Japanese language training in the Air Force, but I at one time I was a pretty good Russian speaker and reader, so I guess the Air Force in its wisdom felt I didn't need any additional language training. I'd also studied in the Soviet Union when I was in college. I was at the Leningrad State University for a semester. So my Russian once upon a time was decent.
So, and two questions on that is, becoming a linguist, did that make you more interested in Russian history? Or was it because you were an intelligence officer that you sort of learned more about the Russian history and the relationship between them and us and them?
Well, when I was in college, I was a history major, although today I would be considered a Russian studies major. So I studied Russian history and Russian literature pretty extensively in college. So I knew enough to be dangerous, I guess, by the time I went into the Air Force. And I also studied East Asian history pretty extensively too. So my initial posting to Japan was fortuitous because I knew a fair amount about Japanese, Korean, and Chinese history when I got there, which came in handy dealing with the Japanese and the Chinese and the Koreans.
Was it did you choose to become an intelligence officer, or was that, so they sort of sussed that out and gave that to you?
No, I wanted to be an intelligence officer. So I actually went through flight screening in the Air Force. So I learned to fly. But I didn't go to undergraduate pilot training because my eyes started to go, and I didn't really, I had the choice to go to UPT or to go to Intel school, and I chose to go to Intel school. I thought, and the Air Force didn't push back too hard because my eyes were not quite 20/20 any longer. So that's what I wanted to do, and it worked out really the best for everybody concerned, I think.
Tell me a bit, because I'm not sure how many people here have ever been to Russia, but you were obviously there during the Cold War. How were you treated while you were there? And what did you sort of find out about the culture that you maybe surprised you?
Well, as a student, and I was there in 1975 and 1976 as a student, I was well treated. The Russian people were fascinated with America and Americans. There was worry about America's intentions vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, but most Russian people wanted to be friendly with Americans. There was also, the Russians kind of culturally have a chip on their shoulder in many ways, and their memory of World War II is a reason for a modern chip on their shoulder, because in their view, they won World War II, and we contributed a little bit, but they won the war, and they should be recognized for that. I also went into the Soviet Union when I was on active duty, and that was a different story. I went on official business and to Moscow and to Leningrad, and we weren't treated badly for the most part, but we were harassed a lot by the KGB, and there was one incident that I was involved in Leningrad that got pretty ugly with the KGB. But that was a professional incident, so I don't really hold it against them.
That sounds hairy. I talk about all this because the two books, Able Archers and The Righteous Arrows, they're historical fiction. So they're all based off of your own personal experiences. You're writing, first person, Kevin, the lead, sort of you. So my question is sort of, as you started to put this story together, was this something that you always sort of had in the back of your mind? Were you always writing? Or was this something that you sort of found a passion for after you finished your service?
Well, I didn't start writing until actually some years after I retired. I retired from industry at the end of 2016. And people had encouraged me over the years to think about writing. And I was tempted to write about the Able Archer crisis, but everything was so highly classified until about 2015, 2016, 2017, that it was impossible to write about it until things began to be declassified. And then once I did turn to writing, I did write about the Able Archer crisis first, and I decided to write fiction rather than nonfiction because I wanted to humanize the people involved in those crises, and it seemed that historical fiction was the best way to do that. And once I got into writing, it seemed that first person narration was the best way to communicate the story. And so I have two first person narrators in the books in this series, beginning with the Able Archers. One is an American named Kevin Katani, who's based on me, more or less. And then the other is a Soviet officer, Ivan Levchenko, who is a Soviet GRU officer, military intelligence officer. And Levchenko is based on KGB and GRU officers that I knew, either as defectors to the United States or as active duty GRU officers in Berlin. So Levchenko is a blend of the best characteristics of some of those guys that I knew back in the 80s.
So obviously Kevin and Yvonne, they're pretty close. In Able Archers, and there's no spoilers here. If you read the back of The Righteous Arrows, you kind of get an overview of the fact that they are able to help avoid a nuclear war in the first book. They grow pretty close during that time. Did you grow pretty close with any of your counterparts?
I did grow a bit close with a couple of the defectors I worked with. When I was in that Soviet Affairs Directorate job that I mentioned in Washington when I was on active duty, we worked with KGB and GRU defectors, and you got to know those guys pretty well. We traveled with them. We debriefed them, obviously. We also helped them acclimate to American life. And those guys were essentially in what is like a witness protection program because they were, and still are, those that are alive today, you know, they're on the hit list for Russia. And as you know, Russia does reach out and kill people. So anyway, I got to know those guys more intimately, certainly, than the GRU officers I encountered in Berlin were a bit more distant. But you did get to know them a bit as human beings and a little bit about what made them tick. And they all spoke English. All the GRU officers in Berlin had to speak English, or at least the ones that interacted with the Americans had to speak English. And we all spoke Russian, so it was a level playing field.
Brad, I agree with your question. I'm going to ask it next. But first, what is the mindset of somebody who's defected? Is it defeated? Is it empowered?
Yeah, Sean, that's an excellent question. I think in most cases it's a blend of the two. I think defeated may not be the word. Depressed might be a better word, because they've left everything they know behind, and they've left their families behind, and they knew they'd never see them again in most instances. There are some exceptions to that, but they're relatively rare. some of them did feel, I mean, once they got to know the United States a bit, I think they did feel empowered. I think most of them did. I think they felt freed, and they couldn't do anything they wanted to do, and they knew they'd never be able to do that. But that was also true in the Soviet Union. Yeah, so I think it was a combination of lots of different emotions, and but I do think most of them felt they'd made the right decision, even if they had regrets, which most of them did. I think all of them had some regrets, mainly
of defecting.
Yes, mainly because of the family separation and never being able to see family again.
Were their families ever in danger because they defected?
Yes, and they were, in most instances, well, I think in all instances I'm familiar with, at least, the families were not physically harmed, but they were financially harmed. And they were blacklisted from jobs. They were fired from jobs. The Soviets made life very difficult for them economically.
Sorry, my cat jumped on me. Brad, yes, I agree with your question. He says, I wonder how you guard against a defector being a double agent.
Yeah, and I was not counterintelligence, so that wasn't my worry. But it was the worry for counterintelligence people at CIA, FBI, Air Force Office of Special Investigations has a counterintelligence function. So, yeah, I mean, the guys were very thoroughly debriefed, and part of the program was that they would not be exposed to anything particularly sensitive, right? On the US side. One of the defectors I worked with was Victor Belenko, and Belenko died just recently, just a few months ago. And he was a MiG-25 pilot, and he defected to Japan. He flew his MiG-25 from a base in the Soviet Far East to an airfield in northern Japan. And he was a valuable resource, particularly for the Air Force, because he knew Soviet tactics, and he obviously knew the capabilities of the MiG-25 and other aircraft. And we would take him to U.S. air bases and have him talk to U.S. air crews and to F-15 pilots and guys like that. And that was, I think he enjoyed doing that. I think that was very rewarding for him because he felt he was doing something meaningful.
Ben asked, how did the wall coming down in Berlin in '89 affect you?
That's the subject of my third book. And yeah, it's a very good question as well. Personally, I was not on active duty any longer. It affected, and I was in the aerospace and defense business then, and it had, certainly had an impact on the industry, and the end of the Cold War had a huge impact on the industry. I think from a more personal standpoint, the fall of the wall, it felt like, as someone who had been a Soviet area specialist and had devoted, a chunk of my life to that kind of work, I felt a little, even though I was 32 years old when the wall came down, I felt like a dinosaur a bit. Like, the world doesn't need people like me anymore, even though I was doing other things by then. I was, again, in industry, so I probably would have felt even more that way if I was still in the government as a Soviet specialist. but it had a profound effect on I know a lot of people that I had worked with and who felt like their purpose in life had evaporated. And I am actually in my third book, I try to capture that sense in some of the characters' reactions, not just the Americans, but the Soviets as well.
And Brian, I'm going to break in just to say that your third book is scheduled to be released for the 35th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall in November. And you are coming back on our program on November 4th to talk about your memories of that era and, of course, the book and provide us with a history of the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, and I will tell you, Todd, that since we last spoke, unfortunately, that timing is now in question, and the book probably won't come out I definitely won't come out in November, unfortunately. But I'm happy to come and chat with the group in November about the fall of the wall. And I don't at this point have another date for when that book is going to be published, but it won't be in November, unfortunately.
And currently that's called The Wall Breakers. Is that a working title?
Yes, The Wall Breakers, yes. Mm-hmm.
So diving back into the series here, we have Kevin. He's gone through the Able Archer exercise. Bring us up to speed on sort of like the story a bit. Maybe the people that are just finding out about the righteous arrows might want to go back and read Able Archers, but give us sort of an overview of where the story is at as we get into the second book.
The second book begins just a few months after the Able Archers ends, and the Able Archers ends at the end of 1983, and the Righteous Arrows begins in April of 1984, and in real factual history, we thought that the Able Archer crisis had passed, and the acute crisis had passed in November of 1983. Pardon me. However, in the intelligence community, we were pretty alarmed in the winter of 83, 84 that the Soviets were not backing off on their very high level of nuclear alert, and we couldn't quite figure out why. And in late February and into March of 1984, the Soviets actually conducted the largest nuclear war exercise of the entire Cold War. So we were alarmed by all of those developments. And
sorry to interrupt. Was that the Tsar bomb?
That weapon system was part of that exercise, yes. And but this in that exercise I'm referring to, the Soviets, they deployed and activated everything from tactical to theater to strategic nuclear forces. It was alarming. And so the first major event that happens in the Righteous Arrows happens in April of 1984, where Kevin Katani is tasked to go with the military liaison mission into East Germany to penetrate a Soviet nuclear command and control bunker, which we had just recently discovered in intelligence sources. And this was a wartime emergency command bunker. So in other words, it wasn't occupied most of the time. It had been occupied during that March exercise. So just a few weeks before this mission is tasked, the Soviets had used it. It was located in what we called a permanently restricted area. And in East Germany, the Soviets throughout the Cold War had declared huge areas within East Germany as permanently restricted, meaning the US and French and British military liaison missions were never allowed to go into those areas. And the MLM went into those areas very rarely, because it was lethal risk to do so. the Soviets ran active patrols, infantry patrols, through those PRAs, and they essentially had orders to shoot anybody who they found, because no one was allowed in those PRAs, and German citizens weren't allowed. Nobody was allowed. So if someone was in there, they weren't supposed to be. So you could use lethal force against them. And because that bunker, and there was an incident like the one I described in the book. In reality, there was an incident like that. And because it was in a permanently restricted area, the Soviets didn't really secure it that robustly. They didn't think we knew where it was anyway. And even if we knew where it was, we wouldn't be stupid enough to go into a PRA to try to get inside it. So that mission that Katanes undertakes is the first real action of the Righteous Arrows. And it's, in a sense, it's an extension of the Able Archers crisis. And that mission, once you read the book, you'll see what the outcome of it was. And that causes a change in Katanes' life. And he's reassigned to a different assignment. And he kind of goes into hiatus for a bit, and then he reemerges 2 years later when he volunteers to go to Pakistan to support the CIA program arming the Mujahideen, fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. So the kind of the first third of the book is in Germany and is an extension of the Able Archers crisis, and then the last 2/3, the action switches to Pakistan and Afghanistan. And then Katanes' Soviet counterpart, Ivan Levchenko, in the Righteous Arrows, in the first third of the book, he's in Germany, but in the latter 2/3, he's promoted to 1-star general, and he is commanding all of the GRU forces in Afghanistan. And so he and Katanes are now on opposite sides, and Katanes helping to arm the Mujahideen who are killing Levchenko's troops. So their relationship takes a turn for the worse, shall we say.
Speaking specifically to Katanes being in that first mission, going to the bunker and infiltrating it. I mean, he's one of the only two that sort of gets in there, gets his hands dirty. As an intelligence officer yourself, were you trained for field work? Was this something based on your own experience too, where like you were in missions?
I was, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so there were, again, the MLM would not undertake a mission like that routinely. It was very rare, but it was, and as I mentioned already, there was a mission similar to that actually took place, and it was very, very high risk. Everybody knew it, and it was, I think it was an indication of just how worried the leadership in the intelligence community was in Washington in the spring of 1984, that we didn't really have a handle on what the hell the Soviets were up to. Why were they rattling the nuclear saber so much, and just what was their status? And were we in for another crisis in 1984 akin to what we just lived through in the fall of 1983? So, yeah.
Did you feel that your training prepared you to be able to go on missions like this? Or were you like maybe thinking about your first mission out? Was it something, because it seems to me like as I started reading Righteous Arrows that Kevin was kind of like Katanes, he's sort of like, this doesn't make sense. I'm not sure if I really, he's a little hesitant to go on this mission.
Yeah, he thinks it's reckless.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, he thinks it's really reckless. And yeah, I mean, and what I do with Katanes is, his experiences are not all my experiences, but they are. What I do with that character is I infuse in him experiences that guys I knew well had.
Hmm.
And I did that in the Able Archers too. In the Able Archers, there's a scene where Katani's in a vehicle in Potsdam, East Germany, that gets rammed by a truck, by a GRU truck. And the driver of Katani's vehicle's killed, Katani's injured. I was never in an incident like that, but I knew people who were. Mm-hmm. And so that's, again, kind of what I try to do with Katani, is use my experience as a basis, but then, you know, infuse him with experiences that other people I knew well had.
Obviously, a ton of your experiences are going to be, you know, funneled into both of these books. What about your research level? Were there any pieces that you had to go back and sort of figure out what actually happened, or how is this factually true in this particular case?
Yeah, I did have to. I researched for this book, The Righteous Arrows. I did a lot of research on how the Soviets fought the war in Afghanistan, and how the GRU operated, how Soviet special forces, their Spetsnaz, how they actually conducted operations in Afghanistan. So I did a lot of reading. There's a lot of literature in Russia about their war in Afghanistan. Lots and lots of source material. So I read quite a bit to try to get that right. And with respect to the CIA program arming the Mujahideen, I did quite a bit of research on that too. I interviewed people who were involved in it. I was involved in it myself peripherally when I was on the air staff, and actually in my first job in industry, we were supporting the CIA operation too. So I had some firsthand knowledge, but I talked to people that were actually on the ground over there doing the nitty-gritty work in Pakistan.
Can you talk a bit? Let's maybe dive into that, sort of how the Soviet war in Afghanistan started. You know, how did that boil over?
Yeah, the Soviet Union never intended to be in Afghanistan for 10 years, which may sound familiar to American ears in terms of our own experience after 9/11. And the war in Afghanistan had roots going back into the early 1970s, but I think the most important trigger event was in 1978. There was what was called by the Afghans a revolution. In any event, it installed a socialist, pro-communist government in Kabul that was supported by the Soviet Union. So that was 1978. The next year, in 1979, by the fall of 79, the Soviets were disillusioned with the communist leader in Kabul. He had done his level best to alienate the Afghan people. He wasn't exercising control over most of the country. And the Soviets, Leonid Brezhnev, who was the Soviet leader at the time, were really worried that there was going to be a counter-revolution, and that Afghanistan would spin out of the Soviet orbit. And some of you may remember something called the Brezhnev Doctrine. And the Brezhnev Doctrine was that the Soviet Union can never allow a country that has become socialist, communist, to retrench. It can never not be a socialist country. Once socialist, it's socialist forever. And they didn't want Afghanistan to be a precedent setter that, this country was a socialist country for a year and a half, but the locals wised up and threw the rascals out. So the Soviet Union, Brezhnev, decided to intervene in Afghanistan to eliminate this leader who was not proving to be a very good leader. And they decided to replace him with another guy who they hoped would be a stronger socialist leader who would be able to take greater control of the country. And to effect that coup, they sent Spetsnaz, GRU, KGB troops into Kabul on Christmas Day, 1979. And they assassinated the leader they had installed the previous year. They killed his entire family, and they installed the new guy. And the Soviets thought that they'd be in and out in 60 to 90 days, that once this was effected, they could help stabilize the situation in the country, and then they could withdraw. And that proved out to be an erroneous assumption. And the new leader was in many ways worse than the old guy. And the Soviets then were dealing with an even less stable situation in Afghanistan, and they started adding more and more troops to conduct stabilization operations. And the more troops they added to Afghanistan in 1980 and 81, the greater the opposition. So these various mujahideen groups really rose up against the occupiers. And in the early 80s, there were a lot of countries arming the mujahideen. China was arming them, Iran was arming them, Saudi Arabia. The United States was a little bit. Jimmy Carter himself, when he was president, and he was president when the Soviets initially went in, he authorized the initial arming of the mujahideen. But it was a low level of, and the arms were not very sophisticated. It was not until 1985 that CIA put together a proposal that finally got funded in the Congress to really up the game, up the ante in Afghanistan with more sophisticated weapons and more of them. And for any of you guys who've seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War that stars Tom Hanks, if you haven't seen Charlie Wilson's War, I recommend it highly. It's a very good movie. And it tells the story pretty accurately of how the CIA program really came together with Charlie Wilson. Charlie Wilson was a congressman from Texas, and he was the real catalyst in the Congress for getting more significant funding together for the Afghan rebel fighters against the Soviets. And most notably, Wilson supported supplying the Mujahideen with Stinger surface-to-air missiles. And the Stinger missiles served to really turn the tide against the Soviets. The Soviets have relied on air power for mobility and firepower around the country. And once the Stingers came into the theater, it made life very difficult for them. And the Stingers are kind of the central weapon system in the Righteous Arrows. And that's why Katani's there. Yeah. And there's a Stinger on the cover of the Righteous Arrows shooting down an Mi-24 Soviet helicopter.
So this wasn't necessarily a proxy war. I mean, we were really just helping out the Mujahideen, and they were not organized. As we understand Afghanistan now, there's a lot of tribes. So were they all working separately? Or were they all working together?
They were both. They did work separately, but there would be coalitions that would come together for fighting seasons. The Northern Alliance, which was our strongest ally, tended to work independently. And they didn't, ethnically, they were different, Tajiks, and they weren't Pashto. They spoke a different language and still do. And so it was they didn't have much interest in aligning themselves with the Southern tribes, and the Southern tribes didn't want them aligned with them anyway. So there were independent actors, but there were these coalitions that would come together. The Haqqani network, which became an important ingredient in the rise of the Taliban. The Haqqanis were very powerful along the Pakistan-Afghan border during the Soviet War, and they organized coalitions to fight the Soviets. And so it was a combination of both. I would suggest that it was a proxy war, and the Soviets certainly viewed it as a proxy war. The Soviets felt that they were fighting the United States as much as they were fighting the Mujahideen, and certainly in the U.S. intelligence community, we viewed it as a proxy war.
Okay,
as I was working with the CIA guys, I was surprised, maybe is the word, by their level of vengeance. And I subtitled The Righteous Arrows, a novel of retribution, because that's how we viewed this war. We viewed the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan as retribution for Vietnam. And that Vietnam was a proxy war between the US and the Soviet Union. They killed 60,000 of our guys, and by God, we were going to kill a lot of them in Afghanistan. And that feeling was really pronounced at CIA, that this is payback time. We're going to kill as many Russians as possible.
Can you talk a bit about your part during the Afghanistan war? Are you able to talk about that?
Yeah, there's not a lot I can say. I think I probably shouldn't go beyond what I've already said, which is that I was in a peripheral, I'll call it, role, helping to support the agency in logistically and otherwise with getting material into the theater. As you know, we were using Pakistan during that war as the place to get arms to the Mujahideen, and it's not the easiest place to get stuff to, especially when you have to get material to the Hindu Kush and over the mountains, over the passes. There aren't that many passes in the mountains between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and and a lot of the logistics were mules and horses and things like that. So the logistical challenges were significant, and that's what we were helping with.
You said it was 10 years that Russia was there. How did their war finish up? When did they decide to leave, and why?
Yeah, a very good question. So Gorbachev, we all remember our friend Mikhail Gorbachev. He became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union in 1985. And interestingly, he came in, he had been on the Politburo, so he'd been part of the senior leadership in the Soviet Union for quite a few years. And so he was familiar with the challenges in Afghanistan when he became General Secretary. And his predilection was, this is a bleeding wound, let's get out. However, in the first few months that he was in office, the Soviet general staff convinced him they could stabilize the situation if they just had more troops. So he authorized in 1985 the largest troop buildup in Afghanistan. Gorbachev did, even though he was skeptical about the war, but he did. But by early 1986, Gorbachev was speaking out publicly against the war, and he had decided by early 1986 that the Soviet Union needed to withdraw. It took them another 3 years to get out, but and one of the themes of the Righteous Arrows is that our Soviet hero Levchenko, in his confrontation that he has with Khatani late in the book, he tells Khatani, "You're supplying stingers to these mujahideen. It's making it more difficult for us to get out. You're actually slowing us down because we can't move equipment around the country. We can't pull our stuff out at every, you're shooting down our helicopters and our fixed wing aircraft. So you're actually making it more difficult for us to leave. We want to leave." And that was a message that Khatani brings back to Washington late in the book that Levchenko has given him. So the Soviets, again, Gorbachev made the decision. The Politburo agreed, certainly by the summer of 1986 to get out, but it took them until early 1989 to actually pull out completely. The circumstances of their departure were humiliating. It hastened the end of the Soviet Union, their defeat in Afghanistan. The population lost faith in the Communist Party for this 10-year war. Gorbachev was weakened tremendously politically inside the country. The Soviet military viewed Gorbachev as weak and that he had stabbed them in the back. So it was pretty ugly. And Soviet, another phenomenon, and I do talk about this in the Righteous Arrows, is that Soviet veterans of the war in Afghanistan were treated very, very badly back home. It was another similarity with some of the treatment Vietnam veterans had in the United States. They were ridiculed on the streets. They couldn't get jobs. There was a high incidence of opioid addiction that troops went home with. It was terrible. So and as I say, the defeat, the humiliation hastened the fall of the Soviet Union. It loosened the grip of the Communist Party on control in the USSR.
Brad asked in the chat, why did the U.S. not learn lessons from the Soviet experience in Afghanistan well enough to avoid similar pitfalls?
Well, it's a question that we were asking shortly after 9/11. I mentioned that I was asked to try to, by hook or by crook, go into the theater myself, which I did not do, but I was involved from my industrial position in support to the wars, both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. At the outset of the war in Afghanistan, and some of you may remember this, there was a lot of debate in Washington, in the New York Times, and other media outlets about our objectives in Afghanistan and how would we avoid what happened to the Soviet Union in the 1980s? How would we avoid what happened to the British in the 19th century? And so there was a lot of discussion about that. I think the initial war in Afghanistan, and you all, again, may remember this, the US engagement was extremely successful. And we defeated Al-Qaeda, we defeated the Taliban in less than 90 days. But the war morphed. And my view is that the war in Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq is beyond our brief tonight, but the war in Afghanistan, the US war in Afghanistan suffered from shifting goals and objectives and set by policymakers at the highest levels. And one way of looking at our 20-year involvement in Afghanistan is that for 20 years, we fought 2 wars simultaneously in Afghanistan. The CIA and special operations fought a counter-terror war to ensure that Al-Qaeda and its fellow travelers could not reconstitute in Afghanistan, while the US military, Central Command, fought a counterinsurgency war against a resurgent Taliban. So there were 2 separate wars going on. And the counter-terror war was extremely successful for all 20 years. The counterinsurgency war was less so. And I think, again, shifting goals and objectives, what were we really trying to achieve in Afghanistan? I mean, the initial goal of going into Afghanistan was to destroy Al-Qaeda. It was a counter-terror goal. In fact, you may remember that we were not interested in fighting the Taliban until the Taliban said they wouldn't give up Al-Qaeda. And we told, President Bush, I think, told the Afghan Taliban leaders, if you just give up the Al-Qaeda, we'll leave you guys alone. And they wouldn't do it. And so we had to defeat the Taliban in order to get to Al-Qaeda. And we did that with CIA, Air Force, Special Operations in the fall of 2001. But again, goals and objectives shifted. We got into nation building, and we got into this counterinsurgency fight against the Taliban. And I think, which looked an awful lot ultimately like the war the Soviets fought in Afghanistan. So I think it's useful. I think it's important to keep in mind that there were 2 different wars going on, a counter-terror war and a counterinsurgency war. And one was very successful. And I think it was successful because it had limited aims, and those goals were clearly understood, and the objectives were easily quantifiable and tracked. And whereas the counterinsurgency war, the goals were pretty fuzzy. It was very, very difficult to identify clear objectives, and you couldn't really tell if you were winning or losing. So that's my point of view.
We're going to continue on with that line here in a sec. Todd, do you want to take our station break?
Let's take our station break.
Great. So let me bring up my share here. And we just want to thank our sponsors, first being Tobacco-Free Adagio Health. They've been with us for quite some time. Tobacco-Free Adagio Health is dedicated to preventing and reducing tobacco use, educating people about tobacco hazards, and advocating for healthier places to live, work, and play. You can find out more about all they have to offer by going to tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. We'd also like to thank UPMC Health Plan for their generous support, or UPMC for Life. Excuse me while Zoom decided to pop something up on my screen. They can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life has plans designed for veterans, by veterans, that can save you money and get you more benefits. You can view all their plan options by going to upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. We also have a recent magazine that just came out. I believe I got it just last week, so everybody should have gotten it by now. If you haven't, it's just because we don't have your address. Please send your address to us, and we'll be sure to get you one of our free quarterly magazines. This one is all about our Thursday night series, Masters of the Air, Wonderful stories in and throughout this magazine. I've heard great reviews of it. So please, if you haven't had a chance to check it out, we'd love to hear your feedback on it as well. Please email us that if you would like. We will put a survey link into the chat. You can let us know what your thoughts are on tonight's program. We look at these very closely, and it's always about just trying to make our programs the best they can possibly be. So we always like hearing your candid feedback. We have some more programs, obviously, coming up Thursday night. The U.S. Army at Guadalcanal. Glenn Flickinger will be hosting this program Thursday night. You can join us for at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And then next Monday, we have our return of our open conversation series. We've been loving these, started these near the beginning of the year, and it's just a great time to get everybody in the room and everybody talking. So bring your topics, there's a lot of great chat here tonight. So if you have thoughts that we don't get to tonight, love to come back and talk about them next week. Because not only do we have an open conversation Monday night, we have one on Thursday night. And I think Greg Yost probably fell out of his chair seeing that we're doing a World War II open conversation, also hosted by Glenn. We're excited to offer this. This is the first one for this year. Great time to bring up any of the World War II topics that you would like, not just focused on air war, but anything you would like. So be sure to join us next Thursday for that. And then, of course, the following Monday, Escape from Saigon, April 1975. That'll be August 12th. We're looking forward to the many programs that we have on offer coming up with BBC. Todd, anything to add?
No, I just want to say, I think one of the special things that we do here on the Scuttlebutt is have interaction with the folks who join us every Monday night, every Thursday night. So we want to make sure that we get the interaction going and the perspectives of everybody who wants to speak, who's part of our community here.
Excellent. And, Brian, I want to jump right back to you because I feel like what you just sort of brought up, the Mujahideen, the Taliban, and Todd, you asked a great question in the green before we started, is that, was it a straight line from the Mujahideen to the Taliban? Or is that a little more crooked?
Yeah, I think it's a crooked line. There are probably some straight lines in there as well. And I already mentioned some of the major components of the Mujahideen, one being the Northern Alliance, which was under the command of Ahmed Massoud in the Soviet war in Afghanistan, and up until 2 days before 9/11, the Northern Alliance had been our closest ally during the Soviet war in Afghanistan and our most reliable military ally, again, under the command of Massoud. And Massoud was assassinated by Al-Qaeda 2 days before 9/11. And when that occurred, I was called over actually to CIA for, again, I'm in industry, I'm not an active government guy, but I was, because of my background, I was asked to come over. And I talked with the Al-Qaeda cell at CIA, which had been in existence for some years prior to 9/11. And they had freaked out because of the assassination of Massoud. And they assumed that something big was about to happen. Why else would they kill Massoud? Because the Al-Qaeda knew Massoud was our number 1 ally in Afghanistan, and that if the United States were to take military action against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, then Massoud would be he'd be the guy we would go to, which was true. So they killed him. So the Northern Alliance had never had anything to do with the Taliban. They, in fact, fought a civil war against the Taliban in the 1990s. The Taliban did, however, grow out of, in part, some of the other tribal groups that were armed during the fight against the Soviets. And there were also fellow travelers who were not really Taliban, but they supported the Taliban, including during the war against NATO, the US and NATO in Afghanistan. So it's not a straight line, but there were definitely some groups in amongst the Mujahideen who morphed later into the Taliban. And remember, something I didn't point out, which I should have, which is when the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, chaos ensued in Afghanistan. The country erupted into civil war. And the primary, not the only people fighting, but the primary forces were the Northern Alliance, our best ally, fighting against groups that became the Taliban. And initially, the Northern Alliance won that civil war, and the Northern Alliance took over Kabul. Subsequently, they were driven out by the Taliban and their fellow travelers. So, and Al-Qaeda was ensconced itself again in Afghanistan, having left Africa. So, again, not a straight line, but it's there are linkages. And I think one point I would make to the team here tonight is that Afghanistan was militarized. The society was militarized by the Soviet war in Afghanistan. And we in the United States contributed to that militarization by our arming of the Mujahideen. But it was, again, to counter the Soviet invasion and occupation. But the bottom line is that by the time the Soviets left, chaos ensued and a militarized society devolved into civil war that lasted for quite a few years into the 1990s, and then helped spawn Al-Qaeda. Or Al-Qaeda came back, as I said, to Afghanistan from Africa and found safe haven with the Taliban. So the roots of the post 9/11 wars, to really understand them, you need to go back to the Soviet war in Afghanistan.
Which, again, is part of the Righteous Arrows. And also, you mentioned that the book 12 Strong deals with the CIA's involvement in those first days after 9/11 into Afghanistan. You mentioned that's quite a good movie as well, if you're looking for a movie. Greg Yost asked in the chat, you'd like to ask if the U.S. had captured or killed bin Laden very quickly, like fall, winter 2001, like at Tora Bora, could the U.S. or G.W. Bush have been able to declare victory and go home and get out of Afghanistan? Like,
I thought so at the time, and a lot of people agreed with me in Washington at the time that, in fact, even with bin Laden escaping into Pakistan, many felt we need to keep our eye on the ball. We need to keep this a counterterrorism operation and not try to rebuild Afghanistan, which I think would have been the better approach for us. Of course, hindsight is 2020, but many of us at the time were worried about mission creep and about, again, not having clearly set objectives for what we wanted Afghanistan to become. The counterterrorism objectives, as I mentioned earlier, I think were always pretty clear. But to the direct question, had we killed bin Laden, which we almost did in Tora Bora in the winter of 2002, things probably would have been different, and the political dynamics would have been different in Washington.
I want to get to Brad's question from earlier, but before we get to that, for the people here that maybe haven't picked up the series yet, does this read more like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, or is this more like James Bond action? You know, where do you see your series sort of fitting genre-wise?
Well, I hesitate to compare myself to John le Carré and his great books. I wrote these books to read like thrillers and like page turners. And the feedback I get is that they both do. In fact, right before we went on the air tonight, I got a few emails from folks that had just finished The Righteous Arrows today, and they several of them said they read it in 2 days. So I want, these stories are pretty tight, and I want them to be page turners. I want them to be, and it's because the events themselves, I think, are so compelling. It doesn't take a great writer to make them page turners. So hopefully I've done well enough that I've done justice to the events and to the people involved in them. So I would say they're not James Bond, but they're not quite Le Carre either. I think they're books that I wrote to educate and to entertain. Because if I'm not entertaining, then people aren't going to read them. So, and again, the reviews I've gotten have been very, very positive that way. So I think they fall somewhere in the middle ground between Le Carre and Ian Fleming. But again, hopefully people learn something from them, and they're thought-provoking, but they're also fun to read and entertaining.
We'll put the link to both books here into the chat. Because I feel like we could do 90 minutes on Russia and Ukraine, I want to go back to that question, Brad, because it's something that I found that I really appreciated out of the Turning Point series on Netflix was that a lot of the beginning of each episode was what was going on in Ukraine, and then flashing back to say, let's tell you the next part of the story as to how we got to where we are. And what amazed me was that it was almost an inevitability. They were going to go into Ukraine almost. That's what I got from that series, but it seemed like Russia was always going to do this, and it was just a matter of time. But Brad's question from earlier was, what are your thoughts on that conflict?
Oh dear, you're right. We could do 90 minutes on that. Well, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has deep roots, but the linkages between Russia and Ukraine have equally deep roots that, as Putin likes to say, go back to the founding of the Rus, and that Kiev is the home city of the Russian people, of the Rus. One of the things I do in my books is my character Ivan Levchenko, our Russian friend, is married to a Ukrainian woman, and he graduated from the Russian Air Force Academy in Kiev, the Soviet Air Force Academy in Kiev, which was a real place. And I wanted to have that Russian-Ukrainian tension in these books right from the beginning. And I wanted to humanize it by making it part of Levchenko's family. That he's Russian, his wife is Ukrainian, his wife's sister and brother-in-law are Ukrainian nationalists back in the 1980s. And it sets up a tension for Levchenko because he's a Soviet GRU officer. He can't be consorting with Ukrainian nationalists. So there are definitely deep roots to this. One other point I would make is that in The Righteous Arrows, I introduced a character who's a US Air Force intelligence officer, and the name I give him is Mike Hosenko, which Hosenko is a Ukrainian surname. And this guy is based on a Ukrainian American officer he was my best friend in the Air Force. And unfortunately, he died quite young. But he was Ukrainian American. He spoke Ukrainian fluently. He spoke Russian fluently. And when we were in Berlin together, I asked him about his first 8 years in the Air Force. He was an F-111 pilot. And the F-111s got to Vietnam toward the end of the war, but he flew 75 missions over the North during the Vietnam War. And I asked him about that the first time we went out to dinner together. And I said, "You're a Ukrainian American, why are you in the Air Force? Tell me your story. Tell me about Vietnam." And his his response to me regarding Vietnam was, well, Vietnam was really good practice. I said, 75 missions over mostly Hanoi and Haiphong doesn't sound like practice to me. He says, no, it's practice. Practice for the real war against the Russians. And he said, that's why I'm in the Air Force. I'm in the United States Air Force for when we go to war against the Soviet Union. That's why I'm here. So that was one man's view. And I knew other Ukrainian Americans in the Air Force who had a similar viewpoint. But anyway, in terms of the war and where it stands today, as I'm sure all of you know, we're in a bit of a stalemate, a bloody stalemate. The overall situation, if you look at the theater, is that the Ukrainians have had their greatest success in the Black Sea, and they've done a pretty remarkable job of hurting the Russian Black Sea fleet, sinking ships, damaging facilities, attacking Sevastopol and other naval facilities, to the point where the Ukrainians have eliminated the Russian threat basically from the Western Black Sea. So that's a huge strategic win for Ukraine, because they're able to get their goods out of the country and they're able to import things. So that's a big thing. Their success in the Black Sea. They've had less success on the ground, the Ukrainians have, and they're essentially in a stalemate in the Donbass and in the south vis-a-vis the Russian ground forces. The Russian Air Force has been doing a pretty good job of hurting infrastructure in Ukraine, as all of you know, I'm sure. The Ukrainians have done a very good job of defending themselves to the extent that they have the equipment to do it, for, in terms of air and missile defense. F-16s are going to finally get in theater, maybe in the early fall. But we've only trained 6 Ukrainian pilots to fly the F-16. 6. So the F-16s are not going to make a difference, certainly not in the near term. And the F-16s are older planes. They're very vulnerable to Soviet aircraft and Soviet air defenses. So they're not going to make that much of a difference at this point. So I from a military standpoint, I see again success in the Black Sea for the Ukrainians, stalemate in the Donbass, stalemate in the ground war generally, and kind of a standoff in the air war. The Ukrainians are striking. Yes, just yesterday they struck targets, Russian Air Force bases deep inside Russia, and they're claiming that they destroyed a fair number of Russian aircraft on the ramp. They probably had some success, but so that's happening. And they're getting, to the extent that Ukraine has longer range systems, they can reach into Russia and do some damage for sure. So generally it's a stalemate at this point, and the Russians aren't going anywhere, and the Ukrainians are dug in and they're tenacious. I don't know that there's a military outcome to this. There will eventually someday be a political one. It's impossible to predict what will happen. NATO's support for the moment is steadfast, but it's just enabling Ukraine to maintain the stalemate. It's not, NATO's support is not enabling Ukraine to do anything more than that. And Ukraine's lost so many men that a ground offensive it's hard to contemplate. So I'll stop there. But
Chris Perella, you had your hand up?
Yes. Yes. Brian, based on all your experience and from your perspective, in your opinion, are we currently in a new Cold War with China in the lead and Russia supporting them, which would be the reverse of the original Cold War with USSR in the lead and China supporting them? Is that happening right now based on what you know?
Yes, I'm not sure I would call it a Cold War, although it's not the worst phrase to apply to it. I think generally around the world, the United States and the West are engaged in a global competition between democracies and authoritarian states. And China is an authoritarian state, as is Russia, as is Iran, as is North Korea, as are a few other fellow travelers, but those are the important ones. And I think the way I view what's going on in the Middle East, that's part of that war. That's part of that competition. Iran is stoking all of this conflict in the Middle East, and Iranian officials, as recently as over the weekend, said this war is not a war between Iran and Israel. This is wars between Iran and the United States. Israel is just an instrument. So Iran clearly views these conflicts, and it's not just Gaza, as you know, it's Lebanon, it's the West Bank, it's the Houthis, it's Netanyahu says they're fighting on 7 fronts, Israel is. So I believe this is a proxy war between Iran and the United States. That's what's going on in the Middle East. Israel is just the instrument, as they like to say. Russia's very deeply involved in the Middle East. They've got major bases in Syria. One of the reasons Russia's been able to absorb the blows the Ukrainians have done to the Black Sea Fleet is they've got a big naval base in Syria, the Russians do. And so the Russians can relocate naval ships down to Syria, and they have done that. They've also relocated bombers, Air Force bombers, to Syria. So Syria is a very important ally for Russia in that region. Of course, Syria is aligned with Iran. China, we all know, is the biggest problem and the biggest threat to not just the United States, but to the entire Western system. And one thing we've learned in this, since the invasion of Ukraine, we probably knew it before the invasion of Ukraine, is that sanctions on Russia, sanctions on Iran are not really very effective. These economic sanctions that we're using, and they're not effective because, led by China, this bloc of authoritarian states has created their own parallel system for commerce, for financial transactions, for global logistics, for trade and energy and the like. So sanctions don't really hurt very much now because our adversaries have smartened up and they've created a parallel universe of structures and systems that don't rely on Western structures and systems. So that should be alarming to us. And I know there are people in the Pentagon and who are in the intelligence community who are very concerned about it. So I see it as, is that a Cold War? Again, it's not the worst term to give it. It's different. You know, we've never really faced this kind of certainly not since World War II, at least, have we faced this kind of authoritarian bloc, if you will. It's not a bloc, but it's a confederation of like-minded countries that have common interests. And one of those common interests is weakening the United States and the West.
Thank you.
I know we're about 5 minutes past time here, but I wanted to remind everybody, Brian Morra, 2 books, Able Archers, The Righteous Arrows. You can get them. I put the link in the chat. Henry, thank you also for putting in the map, I believe, of the Ukraine war there in the chat as well. Todd, wanted to go to you if you had any final thoughts or questions.
I just want to thank Brian for coming on and educating us and doing so much work, thoughtful work on a really important history that many of us lived, but we don't consider very often, and that is the late Cold War, that last decade of a war that lasted 45 years or so. And it's kind of ironic that we don't consider that period as much as we should, because the end of the Cold War set up our own 21st century. I mean, we're living in the wake of that huge transformation of the globe. And so I'm glad that you're doing work that both educates and entertains us, telling stories from that era.
Well, thank you, Todd. Thank you, Sean. It's been a great amount of fun tonight, as it was the last time we got together. And you've got a great group and great questions. I really appreciate that. And if you do go to my website, and I certainly encourage you to order the books there. You can get them on, I've got buttons for Amazon, links for Barnes and Noble, wherever your favorite bookseller is. But there's also on my website a lot of historical information. I have a newsletter that you can sign up for, and I only do that newsletter once every 6 weeks or so you won't get inundated with stuff. But I try to put a thoughtful one-pager together for people to look at. And I also on my website have contact information. I've got an author's email address. So, if you read the books and if you've got questions, don't hesitate to send me an email at that author's email address. And I promise I will get back to you, and love to engage with folks that read the books. So again, thank you all for your attention. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Brian. We really appreciate your time. We're looking forward to having you back, I believe November, to talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall. Also looking forward to the tentative title, The Wall Breakers, the 3rd in the series. You're welcome back, please, to come back and talk about the end of the series, where we go from here, but to chat more about this. And thank you all for being here this evening. And we look forward to seeing you to talk about Guadalcanal on Thursday night with Glenn Flickinger. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And Brian, thank you so much again.
Thank you very much.